First up is Shazam! Fury of the Gods, and I only have the vaguest of recollections about the first film. I don't think it was that memorable. I recall being somewhere between ambivalent to, on a more positive note, mildly amused by some of the antics. I do think by the time we get to this second film, I am head scratching a whole bunch as to what went so wrong. I mean, mildly wrong to extremely wrong, because there are a couple of things we'll address. But I do appreciate that as a whole, DC films tend to skew on the darker side, and Shazam was a more buoyant entry into their universe, and it felt more accessible and less depressing. And, at the time, it was a bit overly saccharine for me, and I know they're courting that sort of youth audience, which I don't fall into anymore, sadly. And, sometimes I wonder, is it too off-putting for adults? And I don't think that's necessarily the case. But the attempts to be relevant, but when a film is in production for so long and, they're participating in trends that feel already antiquated by the time it exits the screen, I recall, I think it was a bunch of the promo stuff, but it was still in the film. They're flossing in it. And by the time it came out, I was like, oh, I guess that's a thing kids still do, right? I don't know. It's tough to make something feel evergreen when it is aimed at, current youth evolving culture. So I think they tried a little too desperately in this one. They didn't lean as much into like the active trending things. The first one had a lot of social. Okay, maybe I do remember more about the first one than I recall, but a lot of things about being on social media and all that stuff. And this one has dialed that back considerably. But I feel like on the first one, they may have legitimately enjoyed being on set or have been having fun. And by the time that we get to Fury of the Gods, they are forcing that down our throats. And I'm like, oh, this feels like you are trying to sell yourself and trying to sell us too hard on what a joyous occasion and ride it was and how much we're a Shazamily. By the way, they said that 200,000 times at the Hall H panel. And I was just like, okay, this is stop trying to make fetch happen, which is a reference the youth will hopefully get. But, so Shazam! Fury of the Gods. Do you need to have seen the first film to get this one? Probably not necessarily, because these are relatively surface level heroes. There is a complicated backstory to them, but the way that the films have approached them, and also this film takes a moment in the beginning to just go for it. But yeah, it's a bunch of kids who have superpowers that, when they say Shazam, they turn into these godlike figures and have powers and all this stuff. And what I liked about the first one as well is that, it's a story of a kid in the foster care system who finds a found family. And I do think there was a bit more of an emotional core about feeling like an outsider and trying to find acceptance and not feeling there were themes there. For this one, they just sort of gloss over a lot of that. They touch on it maybe once or twice, but even though it's all about this family dynamic, I suppose, yes, you should have seen the first one in order to understand that, but this one just dives right in. And then the biggest question I've been asking myself is, how did they get Helen Mirren and Lucy Liu to agree to be in this? It also has Rachel Zegler, but with no disrespect to her, she's newer to the scene. It's a big hero movie. I could understand why she's like, yeah, okay, of course I'll be in Shazam. But Helen Mirren, Lucy Liu, what? Did the script read so much better on paper than it ended up being in the film? These could theoretically be fun, meaty roles because they are playing the antagonists, but I was not entertained by this film. The action just drags on and on and on. For a film that is basically 2 hours long, it feels much longer, which is disconcerting, or 2 hours and 10 minutes, but I think, again, the joy has kind of been sucked out of the franchise. Part of me wonders, I feel like this was probably already wrapped by the time all the DC shakeups happened, but, did more of that play into it? I don't know what magic was lost between this one and the last one. I mean, I do, because I've identified several of the problems, but I don't know what drove them to remove some of the key emotional points from this storyline and like the bread and butter of why we are connected to these characters. And they thought I don't know if they thought the action would be enough, or they thought that the names of Helen Mirren and Lucy Liu would be enough. I am left puzzled and bewildered as to the choices. The effects are fine, I suppose. The acting is, Zachary Levi, it seems like the right choice for a character, the adult manifestation of a child or a teen character. But he was getting under my skin in this one. And I will acknowledge some of it, probably the scripting and the how do you do fellow youthness of it. But overall, I don't see a particularly compelling reason to go see this. I suppose if your kids are really clamoring, but that's the other thing, right? So I don't think it's for young kids necessarily. And I feel like by the time you are maybe like of appropriate age to see this, you're already going to be off put by the attempts to pander to you. And then for adults who don't have kids or just, general moviegoers or superhero fans and stuff like that, because they have peppered all of that in, it feels a little off-putting. And so, you're effectively potentially alienating the majority of your audiences. So I don't know who they were trying to make this movie for. But overall, I was just really, really bored by it. So I'm going to give it a 2.7 out of 5. The next thing I have this week is a new Amazon Prime series called Swarm, and it is inspired by, I don't want to get this completely right, it's inspired by effectively a rumor that surrounded Beyonce. And I don't think the rumor is necessarily true, but either way, this is clearly drawing from the Beehive. It centers around a character who's obsessed with a female pop icon or pop/hip-hop icon. The fictional character's name is Nyjah, but it is very obviously a Beyonce-esque character. And, the series of extreme things that fans have done or do when they are inspired by a person, I think it's sort of curating from multiple experiences, and I don't know how many of them are real and how many of them are, rumor and all that stuff, but it's an amalgamation of these. At least that was my understanding of it. Dominique Fishback plays Dre, who is the obsessive fan, and she does such a good job in this. Like, for her alone, I think it's worth watching. Chloe Bailey plays one of her best friends, or her best friend, Marissa. And then there are a bunch of guest stars who I don't want to mention because it was more shocking and interesting to see them play out and the roles they played. This show was doing a lot of things, and I would have potentially preferred if they'd explored, there are a bunch of different episodes in different styles, and I almost wish that they had mixed up the styles more, because the first chunk of the season, or I don't even know if it's a limited series or whatever it's going to be, but the first chunk of it is very similar, and then suddenly it starts breaking away, and I'm sure it's intentional, and it's a question of, what is real, what is not, all these things. But I think for Dominique Fishback alone, this is worth watching. I am someone who, has the utmost respect for Beyonce and, her fandom. I don't think I'm effectively like a proper member of the Beehive, but I understand fandom to a degree, not to the extreme that this show is presenting, but from that perspective, it's really interesting. Again, the variety of things that they draw from that are either inspired by real life or might actually be real life, and then they've just changed some of the bits and bobs to not get sued. But it's a slower start to get in, and it's probably going to be a little jarring when you first watch it, but I eventually, it's always weird to say like, oh yeah, give yourself 2 or 3 episodes of a show, when yes, the job of the first episode is to grab you, but I think with the structure of streaming shows, it's so different now because they know you're just going to click the next one, and when they drop it all at once, it's just different than a show airing on broadcast or something like that. So I think it's actually worth checking out for the performances alone. The story itself, again, uneven, but just the lengths that this character will go to are fascinating. And then, watching the show try and create a Beyonce-esque character is also interesting. I don't know if enjoyed it is the right word, but I definitely found myself compelled to keep watching it. So I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5. And then next up, I have a film starring Lily Tomlin and Jane Fonda called Moving On. And this week went from sort of buoyant superhero, juvenile, whatever, to it's just going to get dark. But yeah, so it's a very short movie. It's labeled as a comedy. I don't know if that's correct. I think it's a comedy/drama. Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin play estranged friends who reunite as to basically extract revenge upon the widower of one of their other dear friends. And then it's them trying to extract said revenge. It's a tight hour and 25 minutes. You are going to watch this movie because you like the two of them. I think the concept behind it, it's funny because after seeing 80 for Brady, which was their last collaboration, I was like, oh man, I'd really love a crime heist or crime caper starring the two of them. Actually, starring the 4 of them. But this is effectively, attempting to be a crime heist, and I don't know if this wasn't exactly what I was looking for. It's written and directed by Paul Weitz, who did About a Boy, which I absolutely love. He also did American Pie, Admission. He was the exec producer on Mozart in the Jungle, so it's all over the place tonally. But I think it was interesting him trying to, because we have so many preconceived notions about the relationship between the two of them, Lily Tomlin and Jane Fonda. I think Grace and Frankie did a really good job of cementing the modern interpretation of them. But even since 9 to 5, we have a very strong vision of the two of them. I think this movie is very smart about how it plays on that, but gives them a little bit of room to play outside of their normal sort of like, oh, Lily Tomlin is the forgetful one who, is high all the time or whatever it is, or Jane Fonda's the sex pot. It gives them a little bit of wiggle room on either end. But at the end of the day, you're still watching Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin, but that's not a bad thing. It also has Malcolm McDowell and Richard Roundtree, which, I thought they both did an excellent job. Like I said, it's labeled as a comedy, but it definitely covers some pretty dark subjects. In some ways, it's a multiverse successor to 9 to 5 in terms of what some of the characters in it have gone through, or like, if they hadn't succeeded in stopping the bosses in 9 to 5. Anyway, I don't want to give too much away, but I feel like there could have been more out of it, honestly. I thought it was a fine watch, but it's mostly based on the strength of the two of their dynamic and just wanting to watch anything new with the two of them. So if you are that level of fan, I think this is a pretty decent performance out of them. If you are, someone who is maybe not as familiar with their work, I don't think I would, this is the thing I would rush to say. I'd watch a 9 to 5, watch a Grace and Frankie. Even watching 80 for Brady is more joyous than this is. But overall, it's watchable, and I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5. The last thing I have this week is a streaming movie called Boston Strangler. It's out on Hulu, and it is about the journalists covering the Boston Strangler murders. It stars Keira Knightley and Carrie Coon, who are interesting choices to pick as Bostonians, but I'm grateful that at least they didn't try and go for like a Mark Wahlberg-esque Boston accent, although you can tell that there's, at least Keira is kind of straining to do the American accent in this, and the fact that I was distracted by it tells you how compelling the story was. It's also got Alessandro Nivola, Chris Cooper, and the thing that was, I think, most disappointing to me about this is, it's a crime movie. It is a real life event. It is about targeting women, which I am a woman. We live in pretty scary times, honestly, right now. And so the fact that I didn't feel any sense of danger during this for the characters, for myself, any of that stuff, there's so much in the source material that is ripe for the picking, and so you think it should be an easy, you rely on tropes to make the audience feel tense moment, and the fact that they sort of diffused it themselves was, I'm not going to say disconcerting, but it just felt like, what are you doing here? This is being handed to you. How did you kind of squander this opportunity? I think it spent a lot of time trying to build little tension moments, but instead of, I think it may have been better served building to one larger tension moment and then revealing things and how things panned out. I am not someone who is super familiar with how the Boston Strangler story went, etc. And so I was a receptive audience, or, I'm like, okay, cool. Here's a crime that I don't know a ton about, scare me a little bit, and then resolve it, which is always my favorite when it's like, yes, they are caught. And, Zodiac is an excellent example of a journalism-based serial killer, movie. And unfortunately, this comes nowhere near Zodiac, or even a pale even one of the signs of the Zodiac. It's 1/12, which is a bummer because I do appreciate that it's female-led. Yeah, it just felt like it was trying to incorporate too many things, and maybe that's a byproduct of the story it's covering, but it didn't do it efficiently. There were things it could have spent less time on. There were parts of it that I would have preferred it extrapolated on, but it just sort of glossed over. This may have actually been better as a series, honestly. Thinking of something like Dahmer. Not that Dahmer is the greatest, but I did think that drawing some of the tension out, some of the maybe red herrings out into multiple episodes might have served them better than trying to actually just sort of rush through it and not spend enough time on the things that would have potentially been more engaging. So overall, if you're a true crime junkie and you have nothing else left to watch, this is a fine background watch, but I don't think anyone's going to be necessarily, unfortunately, being like, oh my God, Boston Strangler, like, did you know, or I learned something new, except for maybe the fact that it's, female reporters covering it. But yeah, so unfortunately, I'm going to give it a 2.6 out of 5.